In 2018, a NASA climate scientist named Gavin Schmidt and an astrophysicist named Adam Frank published a paper in the International Journal of Astrobiology. Schmidt runs the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, one of the most prestigious climate science positions on the planet. Frank is a professor at the University of Rochester. These are not fringe figures. They are not conspiracy theorists. They do not believe in ancient aliens. The paper they published was called the Silurian Hypothesis. Would it be possible to detect an industrial civilization in the geological record? And what it asked was this: if a technologically advanced civilization had existed on Earth before humans, millions of years ago, before the dinosaurs, before the mammals, possibly before the age of reptiles entirely, would we be able to find the evidence? Their answer was carefully hedged but structurally alarming. Probably not. Or at least, not easily. And in some cases, possibly not at all. The Wu name comes from Doctor Who, a 1970 episode featuring a fictional species of intelligent reptiles called Silurians, who supposedly dominated Earth before humans. Schmidt and Frank borrowed it partly as a nod and partly as a precise label. A civilization existing in the deep geological past, separated from us by enough time that its physical traces have been digested, erased, or transformed beyond recognition by the same geological and chemical processes that erase everything eventually. This video is not going to tell you that there was a prior civilization. There is no confirmed evidence of one. The Silurian Hypothesis, as Schmidt and Frank framed it, is not a claim. It is a question, a formally posed scientific question about the limits of our ability to detect past industrial activity in the rock record. But that question, once you follow it to its logical end, leads somewhere genuinely unsettling. It leads to the possibility that the geological record, the 4.5 billion year archive of Earth's history that we read through isotope ratios and fossil beds and sediment cores, might contain a prior civilization's fingerprints, and that those fingerprints might look to us like a natural geological event. And it leads to the further possibility that we already know what some of those fingerprints would look like, because we are currently making them. We start with what the geological record actually is, and what it is not. Chapter 1: What the rock record actually tells us. The history of Earth is stored in rock, not perfectly, not completely, not in the way a hard drive stores data. Every bit preserved, every file recoverable, every piece of information intact in principle, even if you do not know where to look. The geological record is more like a library that has burned and flooded and been partially rebuilt several times. Where some rooms are intact and meticulously cataloged, some have been entirely destroyed, and some contain pages that have been chemically altered until the writing is illegible. What survives is a fraction of what existed. What we can read is a fraction of what survives. And what we can correctly interpret is a fraction of what we can read. This is not a criticism of geology. Geology is extraordinarily powerful. The science that reads the history of a planet from the chemistry of its rocks is one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements in the history of science. The geologic timescale, calibrated to millions of years of precision using radiometric dating, the identification of past climates from isotope ratios in ancient ice and sediment, the reconstruction of past ocean chemistry from the shells of long-dead organisms. These are genuine, hard-won triumphs of human knowledge. But the geological record has specific, well-characterized limitations. Understanding those limitations is the starting point for understanding the Silurian hypothesis. The first limitation is preservation. Most organisms that have ever lived on Earth left no fossil record whatsoever. The standard estimate is that the fossilized remains of less than 1% of all species that have ever existed have been discovered. Fossilization requires a specific and fairly improbable sequence of events. The organism must die in or near water. It must be buried quickly before decomposition or scavenging. The burial sediment must be mineralized in a way that preserves the structure. That mineralized material must not be destroyed by heat, pressure, or tectonic activity over millions of years. And it must eventually be exposed at the surface, in a location and at a time where a human happens to find it. Most organisms, most of the time, are simply eaten or decomposed. The information they contained returns to the carbon and nitrogen cycles of the biosphere and is gone. The preservation problem is even more acute for the specific question the Silurian hypothesis asks, because the kinds of organisms most likely to build a civilization are also the kinds least likely to fossilize well. Hard-shelled marine invertebrates, clams, snails, corals, fossilize readily because their shells mineralize quickly and resist decomposition. Soft-bodied organisms, terrestrial organisms, and large-brained active animals fossilize poorly. The brain itself, the most relevant organ, never fossilizes at all. We infer neural complexity from endocasts, the internal impressions of skull cavities, and from the ratio of brain volume to body mass estimated from fragmentary skull bones. Many species leave no skull material whatsoever. This matters for the Silurian hypothesis because any species intelligent enough to build a civilization would presumably be a large, mobile, cognitively complex animal. Exactly the kind of organism whose fossil record is most incomplete. The bias in the fossil record is not random. It systematically underrepresents the organisms that are most relevant to the question of prior civilizations and overrepresents the hard-shelled, low-mobility, low-complexity organisms that are least relevant. If a technologically advanced species existed and went extinct, its remains would be among the least likely in the entire biosphere to survive in the geological record. There is also a geographic bias. The geological record is best preserved and most thoroughly studied in North America, Europe, China, and Australia, regions with active geological research communities and accessible exposures of rock from many periods. Large portions of the world, much of Africa, South America, Central Asia, the deep ocean floors, are geologically undersampled. A prior civilization that happened to be concentrated in a region that is now geologically inaccessible, or that has been extensively metamorphosed by subsequent tectonic activity, would leave an even sparser record than one situated where preservation and sampling are optimal. The second limitation is temporal resolution. The older the rocks, the harder it is to distinguish events separated by short periods of time. In very old rocks from hundreds of millions of years ago, a geological moment might represent thousands to tens of thousands of years. A civilization that existed for 100,000 years left chemical and physical signatures in its local environment and then collapsed might leave a signature that compressed into a centimeter of ancient rock is indistinguishable from a natural environmental fluctuation. The temporal compression of deep time is one of the most counterintuitive challenges in geology. A century of industrial activity at our current scale would leave a layer in the sediment record roughly as thick as a human hair. In 100 million years, even that might be gone. The third limitation is chemical transformation. Rocks are not static. They are subject to diagenesis, the chemical and physical changes that occur after sediment is deposited and compacted, and to metamorphism when exposed to heat and pressure from tectonic processes. The chemical signatures of past events, the isotope ratios, the molecular compounds, the trace element abundances, change over time as the rocks are processed through the Earth's interior chemistry. Information degrades. Signals that would be clear in a recent rock core become ambiguous or invisible in ancient ones. The fourth limitation, and the one most directly relevant to the Silurian hypothesis, is that we have not looked everywhere. The sedimentary rock exposed at the Earth's surface, accessible to geological survey, represents a small fraction of the total sedimentary record. Most of Earth's sedimentary history is buried kilometers below the surface, at the bottom of the ocean, or subducted into the mantle and gone forever. Of the rock that is accessible, only a fraction has been systematically surveyed and sampled. Of that fraction, only a portion has been analyzed for the specific chemical signatures that would be relevant to detecting past industrial activity. When Schmidt and Frank posed their question, they were not asking, did a prior civilization exist? They were asking, given the actual limitations of the geological record, what would we expect to find if one had? And would we recognize it if we found it? Chapter 2. What industrial civilization looks like from the outside. To understand what geological traces a prior civilization might leave, you need to understand what geological traces our civilization is already leaving. We are, at this moment, in the process of writing our own entry into the geological record. Geologists studying Earth's sediment 50 million years from now, if any exist to do so, will find a distinctive layer corresponding to the present epoch. They have already given this epoch a name, the Anthropocene, and the signatures it contains are extensive. The most prominent is carbon. Since the Industrial Revolution, human combustion of fossil fuels has released approximately 1.7 trillion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This carbon, burned from ancient reservoirs of coal, oil, and natural gas, has a specific isotopic signature. Fossil fuel carbon is depleted in the heavier isotopes of carbon, carbon-13 and carbon-14, compared to atmospheric carbon. As this isotopically depleted carbon has entered the atmosphere and been absorbed into the ocean and incorporated into the shells and organic tissues of marine organisms, it has left a measurable shift in the carbon isotope ratio of marine sediments worldwide. This is called the Suez effect, first identified by Hans Suess in 1955. And it is one of the clearest chemical fingerprints of industrial activity in the geological record. The second prominent signature is nitrogen. The Haber-Bosch process, invented in the early 20th century, takes nitrogen from the atmosphere and converts it into ammonia, which is then used as fertilizer. This industrial, Nitrogen fixation has roughly doubled the rate at which reactive nitrogen enters the Earth's terrestrial ecosystem compared to the pre-industrial rate. This massive influx of reactive nitrogen has left measurable isotopic signatures in sediment cores from lakes and coastal oceans, and has altered the nitrogen cycle in ways that are geologically distinct from anything in the pre-industrial record. The third is the presence of specific synthetic compounds. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, are produced by incomplete combustion of organic material. They are naturally present in sediment from wildfires, but industrial combustion produces them at vastly higher rates and in specific molecular ratios that differ from natural combustion. Persistent organic pollutants, DDT, PCBs, certain flame retardants, are synthetic molecules that do not exist in nature and have been found in sediment cores from the deep ocean floor, the polar ice caps, the Tibetan Plateau, and the bodies of marine mammals in the most remote parts of the world. These molecules will persist in the sediment record for millions of years in some form, though their original molecular structure will eventually be altered by diagenesis. They leave detectable traces of their presence. The fourth is plastics. Humanity has produced roughly 9 billion tons of plastic since the 1950s. A significant fraction of this has entered the environment and will be incorporated into the sedimentary record. Microplastic particles have been found in sediment cores from the deep ocean and in ice cores from the Arctic and Antarctic. Whether plastic polymers will survive in recognizable form for millions of years is uncertain. Most will be fragmented, potentially altered, and may eventually be broken down into hydrocarbons indistinguishable from natural organic material. But the specific types of plastic, polyethylene, polypropylene, PET, PVC, are not produced by any natural process, and their presence, even in degraded form, might be detectable. The fifth is radionuclides. The detonation of nuclear weapons between 1945 and 1963 deposited a global layer of radioactive isotopes, particularly cesium-137 and plutonium-239 and 240, in sediments worldwide. This layer is, in fact, the primary proposed marker of the beginning of the Anthropocene in the formal stratigraphic record, a globally synchronous, chemically distinct layer that appears simultaneously in sediment cores from around the world, precisely dated to the nuclear testing era. The half-life of plutonium-239 is 24,100 years, long enough to be detectable for hundreds of thousands of years, but short enough to be completely gone after a few million. The sixth is the physical alteration of the landscape. Humanity moves more rock and soil per year than all natural geological processes combined, rivers, glaciers, weathering, and has been doing so for decades. We have mined billions of tons of material from the Earth's crust, constructed vast artificial structures, straightened rivers, drained wetlands, and reshaped coastlines. The physical signature of this activity in the sediment record, the specific pattern of erosion, deposition, and landscape change, is distinct from any natural process and will be visible in future geological surveys. And the seventh, perhaps the most globally significant, is the biosphere itself. We are currently driving what many biologists call the sixth mass extinction, a rapid, geologically abrupt reduction in the diversity of life on Earth. The fossil record of the current epoch will show a sudden disappearance of a large fraction of species across all taxonomic groups, followed, assuming the crisis is survived, by a recovery phase. Mass extinction events are detectable in the fossil record millions of years later. This one will be no different. Now here is the key question that Schmidt and Frank were asking. But first, there is a perspective shift that has to happen before the question can be properly posed, and it requires thinking about time in a way that most people never have occasion to do. The entire span of recorded human history, from the first written language in Mesopotamia, roughly 5,000 years ago, to the present, represents 0.0001% of the age of the Earth. The Industrial Revolution, which produced the most geologically significant human activity, has been running for 200 years. The Anthropocene, from the great acceleration of the 1950s to the present, is 75 years old. In the geological record, that 75-year period will be compressed into a layer approximately as thick as a playing card. In 100 million years, that layer, if it survives at all, will be a fraction of a millimeter of altered sediment, detectable only by the most careful chemical analysis. The entire visible legacy of human civilization, every road, every building, every dam, every city, will be gone without trace in the rock record within a few tens of millions of years. What remains will be chemical, the isotope ratios, the trace element anomalies, the molecular fossils of specific compounds that were not present before the industrial era. Now take all of these signatures: the carbon isotope shift, the nitrogen isotope shift, the synthetic organics, the radionuclides, the physical landscape alteration, the mass extinction, and ask, would they be clearly recognizable as the products of an industrial civilization to a geologist examining ancient rocks? Or would some of them be ambiguous? Would some of them look like natural events? The answer, it turns out, is genuinely uncomfortable. Chapter 3. The PETM. Earth's most disturbing geological comparison. In the geological record, roughly 56 million years ago, there is an event that has been studied extensively by paleoclimatologists for what it can tell us about rapid climate change. It is called the Paleocene-Eocene Thermal Maximum, or PETM, and it is the closest natural analog in the geological record to what humanity is currently doing to the Earth's climate system. The PETM was a period of geologically rapid global warming that lasted approximately 170,000 years and raised global average temperatures by approximately 5 to 8 degrees Celsius. The warming was associated with a massive injection of carbon into the atmosphere. An injection estimated at somewhere between 2,000 and 20,000 gigatons of carbon over a geologically brief period. The carbon had a distinctive isotopic signature. It was depleted in carbon-13, just as fossil fuel carbon is, indicating that it came from an organic source rather than volcanic outgassing of deep crustal carbon. The PETM produced dramatic changes in the ocean and on land. Ocean acidification, as the excess carbon dissolved into seawater, dissolved the calcium carbonate shells of marine organisms, leaving a distinctive horizon in deep sea sediment cores, where the carbonate-rich ooze of normal sediment gives way to carbonate-poor red clay. The carbonate compensation depth shifted dramatically upward. On land, the thermal maximum drove migration and extinction of species, the rapid evolution of new mammalian lineages, and changes in the distribution of forests that are recorded in pollen cores from sediments of that age. The PETM is one of the most intensively studied events in the geological record, precisely because it provides a natural laboratory for understanding how the Earth's carbon cycle and climate system respond to a rapid, large-scale carbon injection. Hundreds of scientific papers have been written analyzing its causes, its dynamics, and its aftermath. One aspect of the PETM that deserves specific attention in the context of the Silurian hypothesis is the rate of carbon injection. For decades, the PETM carbon injection was described as geologically rapid, meaning that it occurred over a period short enough to be resolved as an event in the Nyawaiwi sediment record, perhaps tens of thousands of years. This framing made the PETM seem qualitatively different from human fossil fuel emissions, which have been occurring over roughly 2 centuries. But more recent, higher resolution studies of PETM sediment cores have found evidence that at least some of the carbon was injected over periods as short as thousands of years. A 2022 study analyzing boron isotopes in PETM foraminifera, microscopic marine organisms whose shells record ocean pH and therefore atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration, found evidence for intervals of carbon injection within the PETM that were comparable in rate to current human emissions. This is a striking finding. It means that if the PETM were caused by industrial activity, the geological record is consistent with it. The rate would fit. The isotope signature would fit. The ocean acidification would fit. The warming magnitude would fit. This does not make the industrial origin hypothesis correct. The natural cause hypotheses are better supported by the totality of evidence, but it removes one of the potential objections to the industrial hypothesis, which was the claim that the PETM carbon injection was simply too slow to be industrial in origin. It was not, or at least not in every phase. Here is what is remarkable about the PETM in the context of the Silurian hypothesis. The cause of the PETM is not known with certainty. There are multiple competing hypotheses, none of which has been definitively confirmed. The leading candidates include a massive destabilization of seafloor methane hydrates, frozen methane trapped in ice-like structures on the continental shelves, triggered by warming from another cause, a very large igneous province, a period of flood basalt volcanism, releasing both carbon dioxide and methane, a comet or asteroid impact into carbon-rich sediments, and interactions between volcanism, methane release, and feedback mechanisms in the carbon cycle that amplified an initially smaller perturbation. Note what is not on that list: industrial activity by a technologically advanced species. It is not on the list because there is no evidence for it. But Schmidt and Frank's point is this: if the cause of the PETM were industrial activity by a civilization that existed 56 million years ago and then collapsed, would the evidence look different from the natural hypotheses? The answer is that it might not. The carbon isotope signature of the PETM is consistent with an organic carbon source, and industrial combustion of fossil fuels is an organic carbon source. The rate of carbon injection in the PETM, estimated from the sediment record, is comparable to some scenarios for human carbon emissions over the next few centuries. The temperature increase is in the range of current high-end projections for anthropogenic climate change. The ocean acidification signature is chemically similar to what ocean acidification from fossil fuel combustion would produce. If the PETM were caused by an industrial civilization, the geological evidence would look to a geologist 50 million years later, roughly like what we actually observe. The carbon isotope excursion, the carbonate dissolution horizon, the warming spike, the biotic disruption, all of it is consistent with a rapid industrial carbon release. This does not mean the PETM was caused by a civilization. The evidence for natural causes, particularly the association with large igneous province activity and the specific dynamics of the methane hydrate destabilization, is substantial. The PETM is almost certainly a natural event, but the mere fact that it is consistent with industrial activity, that a geologist examining the PETM record in isolation, without the broader context of Earth's geological history, could not definitively exclude industrial origin on the basis of the chemistry alone, is the core of what makes the Silurian hypothesis interesting rather than dismissible. The chemical signatures of industrial civilization overlap with the signatures of natural geological events. The overlap is imperfect, but it is real. Chapter 4: The Deep Time Problem. How old is old enough to erase everything? The PETM is 56 million years old. The question of whether we could detect a prior civilization in geological records that old is different from the question of whether we could detect one in records that are 500 million years old, or 200 million, or 100 million. Time matters enormously. The older the event, the greater the diagenetic alteration of the rock, the greater the probability of tectonic destruction, the greater the uncertainty in dating, and the smaller the surviving fraction of whatever signal was originally present. Let us run through the numbers concretely. Our industrial civilization has existed, in the sense of large-scale fossil fuel combustion, for approximately 200 years. Let's be generous and say a prior civilization existed for 1 million years, 10 times longer than anatomically modern humans have existed, and far longer than we have been technologically capable. What geological traces would 1 million years of industrial activity leave at various points in the geological past? At 10 million years ago, the ocean's sediment record is relatively complete, dating is precise, and the chemical signals of industrial carbon injection, isotope ratios, PAH abundance, nitrogen signatures, would likely be detectable in well-preserved deep-sea cores, though interpretation would require careful analysis to distinguish from natural events. The biological signature, a geologically abrupt mass extinction, would be clearly visible in the fossil record. This is close enough in time that radioactive isotopes with long half-lives, like certain uranium decay products, might retain anomalous abundances. Physical structures made of processed metal would likely be gone. Corrosion and diagenesis over 10 million years degrades even the most chemically resistant metals, but trace metal anomalies in sediment might persist. At 100 million years ago, we are now in the Cretaceous, the age of the dinosaurs. The sediment record is patchier. Diagenesis has significantly altered the chemistry of rocks from this era. Carbon isotope excursions from 100 million years ago are detectable, but require careful interpretation to separate from the many natural carbon cycle fluctuations of that era. The organic molecular signature, PAH-specific biomarkers, would be heavily altered, with most specific compounds unrecognizable. A mass extinction at this point in time would be visible as an anomalous biodiversity dip, but the temporal resolution would be limited. It might be impossible to distinguish a 10,000-year civilizational collapse from a 100,000-year natural recovery and decline cycle. No physical artifacts, buildings, machines, roads would survive. Processed metal traces would be undetectable above natural abundance variation. The most persistent signal would be geochemical, specific trace element ratios and isotope anomalies. At 300 million years ago, the Carboniferous and Permian, the rock record from this period is significantly less complete than for the Mesozoic. Large portions of Carboniferous and Permian rocks have been subducted, metamorphosed, or eroded in the intervening time. The chemical signatures of industrial activity, if ever present, would have been substantially altered. Carbon isotope excursions from this era are known. The end Permian extinction at 252 million years ago is associated with a massive carbon isotope excursion from the Siberian Traps volcanism. And any prior civilizational carbon injection would be competing with multiple natural perturbations of similar or larger magnitude. Distinguishing industrial signal from volcanic noise becomes extremely difficult. At 500 million years ago, the Cambrian, the era of the first complex multicellular life. The sediment record from the Cambrian is fragmentary and heavily metamorphosed in many regions. Carbon isotope excursions from the Cambrian are well documented, but poorly understood. The early Cambrian in particular is marked by multiple large, rapid carbon isotope oscillations whose causes remain debated. Any industrial civilization from this era would have to have been built on non-animal life. There were no vertebrates, no land plants, no insects. The civilization would have to be based on marine organisms, or possibly on early land-colonizing microbes or algae. And the geological evidence of such a civilization would, if it ever existed in the rock record, have been overprinted by 500 million years of subsequent geological activity. The conclusion of this exercise is uncomfortable in a specific way. The further back in time a prior civilization existed, the less likely we are to detect it. Not because the evidence necessarily didn't exist, but because the processes of geological transformation over deep time degrade and erase the kinds of signals that industrial activity produces. There is a detection horizon, a point in the geological past beyond which a prior industrial civilization would be essentially undetectable using current methods. Schmidt and Frank estimated this detection horizon in their paper and concluded that a civilization existing more than a few tens of millions of years ago, with a comparable industrial footprint to our own, lasting a comparable period, would leave chemical signatures that are marginal to undetectable in the surviving geological record. This is not a hypothetical concern. It is a quantitative assessment based on the known chemistry of diagenesis, the known completeness of the sediment record, and the known magnitude of natural geological perturbations that industrial signals would have to be distinguished from. The detection horizon is not absolute. There are specific, long-lived signals that might survive longer, and specific geological settings where preservation is better than average. But as a general statement, if a technologically advanced civilization existed on Earth more than 50 to 100 million years ago, we would probably not know. That is not a claim that one did. It is a statement about what we do not know. And here is where that statement becomes genuinely unsettling if you sit with it long enough. The history of life on Earth extends back 3.8 billion years. Complex animal life extends back 538 million years. The geological record capable of preserving industrial signatures with reasonable fidelity covers perhaps the last 50 to 100 million years, roughly the last 1 to 2% of the history of complex animal life. The remaining 98 to 99% of that history is below the detection horizon for civilizational fingerprints. This means that even if the probability of a technological civilization arising in any given million-year window of Earth's history is very small, the sheer number of windows below the detection horizon is large enough that the expected number of undetectable prior civilizations could be non-negligible. If the probability of a civilization arising per million years of animal life is 1 in 10,000, an extremely conservative assumption, given that we ourselves arose within the last million years, then across 500 million years of complex animal life, the expected number of civilizations is 50. Most of them would be below the detection horizon. We would see none of them. The math is not an argument that civilizations arose. It is an argument about the relationship between what we can observe and what may have happened. The detection horizon creates a blind spot in Earth's history that is, by area, much larger than the visible region. Whether anything was in that blind spot is unknown. The correct epistemic response is not to assume it was empty, and not to assume it contained anything. It is to register that we genuinely cannot say. Chapter 5. What would survive? The long-lived signals. Given the limitations described above, Schmidt and Frank asked a more targeted question. What specific geochemical signals would be the most persistent and distinctive markers of industrial civilization? And have any anomalous versions of those signals been observed in the ancient record? The answer involves 5 categories of evidence that they judged to have the best chance of surviving across the relevant timescales. The first and most robust is the carbon isotope excursion. As discussed with the PETM, a rapid injection of isotopically light carbon, depleted in carbon-13, is a distinctive signal in the marine sediment record. Industrial civilization burning fossil fuels would produce exactly this kind of excursion. Carbon isotope excursions are detectable in sediments hundreds of millions of years old. They are also produced by volcanism, methane release, and other natural processes. The key diagnostic is the rate and magnitude. A civilizational carbon injection would be expected to be rapid by geological standards, but slower than, say, a large bolide impact. Whether a specific carbon isotope excursion in the ancient record was produced industrially or naturally could only be determined by examining the full suite of associated geochemical signals, not the isotope anomaly alone. The second is the nitrogen isotope excursion. Industrial nitrogen fixation produces reactive nitrogen with a specific isotopic signature distinct from biological nitrogen fixation. A planet-wide Haber-Bosch equivalent process would leave nitrogen isotope anomalies in marine and lacustrine sediments. Nitrogen isotope records from the ancient geological past are less well studied than carbon records, but anomalies exist in the record that have not been fully explained. Whether any of them could reflect industrial nitrogen fixation is an open question, not claimed, but not definitively excluded. The third category is trace metal anomalies. Industrial activity involves the mining, smelting, and dispersal of metals at rates that vastly exceed natural weathering and volcanism. Lead, copper, zinc, mercury, and other metals are released into the environment by industrial processes in specific ratios and at specific locations, and rates that leave signatures in sediment cores. Lead isotope ratios are particularly useful because different lead ore deposits have different isotopic compositions, and smelting lead from a specific ore deposit produces a specific isotopic signature that can be distinguished from natural background lead. The Roman lead smelting signature from the period of the Roman Empire is detectable in Greenland ice cores as a clear anomaly above the natural background, appearing approximately 2,000 years ago and disappearing with the fall of Rome. The Roman example is worth pausing on because it is the closest real-world demonstration we have of a pre-industrial civilization leaving a detectable, interpretable chemical signature in the geological record at significant remove in time. Rome was not an industrial civilization in the modern sense. It had no fossil fuel combustion, no synthetic chemicals, no nuclear technology. Its primary metal-intensive industries were silver mining, which produced lead as a byproduct of the smelting process, lead pipe manufacture for plumbing, lead-lined vessels for cooking and wine storage, and the massive smelting operations associated with supplying a Mediterranean empire with metal tools and weapons. The lead emissions from Roman mining and smelting, distributed through the atmosphere and deposited globally, are detectable in ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica, in peat bog records from Ireland and Northern Europe, and in lake sediment cores from Scandinavia and the Alps. The ice core record shows Roman lead peaking during the height of the empire, roughly the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, declining sharply during the 3rd century crisis, partially recovering during the late empire, and then plummeting during the early medieval period after Rome's collapse. The recovery of lead levels in ice cores tracks the economic recovery of medieval Europe and the Industrial Revolution with striking fidelity. What makes the Roman case significant for the Silurian hypothesis is this. Rome's total lead emissions over 8 centuries of empire were roughly 400,000 tons. That is far less than modern industrial lead emissions, and the signal is already detectable at a 2,000-year remove in well-preserved polar ice. An industrial civilization burning fossil fuels for millions of years would generate metal pollution many orders of magnitude larger, even accounting for diagenetic degradation of the signal in very old rocks. The scale difference is enormous. An industrial civilization operating for millions of years would leave a much larger metal signature. However, the lead isotope record from ancient times is complicated by natural volcanic lead sources and by diagenetic redistribution of lead in the sediment column. And the most chemically reactive metals, copper, zinc, lead, are extensively mobilized by groundwater over geological time, making their preservation in the ancient record uncertain. The long-term survival of metal pollution signatures beyond a few tens of millions of years is not guaranteed. The fourth is the phosphorus cycle anomaly. Industrial agriculture mobilizes phosphorus at rates that exceed natural weathering. This excess phosphorus enters rivers, lakes, and coastal oceans, producing eutrophication, algal blooms, oxygen depletion, and dead zones. The sediment record of eutrophication events is well characterized. Layers of organic-rich, laminated sediment, depleted in oxygen, with specific biomarker signatures from algae and cyanobacteria. Natural eutrophication events occur, but an industrial civilization operating globally for millions of years would produce a scale of phosphorus mobilization distinct from natural events. Whether this would be recognizable in the ancient record is uncertain. Phosphorus geochemistry is complex, and the specific signatures would need to be distinguished from natural variations in the phosphorus cycle driven by weathering, volcanism, and ocean circulation changes. The fifth is the most speculative, but potentially the most distinctive: nuclear waste or anomalous radionuclide ratios. A civilization that developed nuclear technology would produce specific isotope ratios: enriched uranium, plutonium, specific fission products that have no natural counterpart. Most of these would decay to undetectable levels within millions of years. But the decay of long-lived radioactive isotopes produces stable daughter isotopes in specific ratios that are not produced by any natural nuclear process. Uranium-235 enrichment, for example, leaves a specific signature in the ratio of lead-206 to lead-207 in surrounding rock, because U-235 and U-238 decay to different lead isotopes at different rates. A sufficiently large nuclear industry might leave anomalous lead isotope ratios that would persist in the geological record essentially indefinitely, because lead is a stable element and does not decay further. This is genuinely the most interesting category, because it is the only one that would be unambiguously non-natural. Carbon isotope excursions, nitrogen anomalies, and metal pollution all have natural analogs. Anomalous nuclear isotope ratios from enrichment and fission products have no natural source. They would be a smoking gun. Schmidt and Frank noted that no such anomalous nuclear isotope ratios consistent with artificial enrichment have been identified in the ancient geological record. This is not a clean bill of health. The record has not been exhaustively searched for this signature, and the search would require extraordinarily precise isotope measurements in carefully selected ancient rocks. But the absence of a known anomaly is at least weakly reassuring. Chapter 6: The Oklo Natural Nuclear Reactor. A cautionary tale. There is, however, a specific case that complicates the no anomalous nuclear isotope ratios point: the Oklo Natural Nuclear Reactor. In 1972, workers at a uranium processing facility in France noticed that ore from a mine in Oklo, in what is now the Gabon Republic in Central Africa, was depleted in uranium-235 relative to the standard natural abundance. Uranium-235 constitutes about 0.72% of natural uranium everywhere on Earth. This ratio is consistent across essentially all uranium deposits worldwide, because uranium was formed in the same stellar nucleosynthesis events that produced the Earth's heavy elements, and has been decaying at a known rate ever since. the Oklo-uranium was anomalous. Its uranium-235 fraction was lower than expected. The investigation that followed revealed something extraordinary. Approximately 2 billion years ago, the uranium ore at Oklo was sufficiently enriched in uranium-235 because much less time had elapsed since the element's formation, and uranium-235 decays faster than uranium-238, so the 2 billion-year-old ore was naturally enriched compared to today's standard, and was surrounded by a natural moderator of water-saturated rock. The conditions were met for a sustained nuclear fission chain reaction. Oklo, 2 billion years ago, was a naturally occurring nuclear reactor. It operated on and off for several 100,000 years, fissioning uranium-235 and producing the same fission products that a human-built nuclear reactor produces, including plutonium and specific fission product isotope ratios. The Oklo reactor is remarkable for several reasons, but in the context of the Silurian hypothesis, it matters for a specific one. The fission products of Oklo are detectable in the rock today. They have been studied extensively, and their isotope ratios are well characterized. The same geochemical techniques used to identify natural nuclear reactors, like Oklo, could, in principle, be used to identify artificial nuclear reactors or waste products from nuclear weapons programs in the ancient geological record. But Oklo also demonstrates exactly how ambiguous such signals can be. When the Oklo anomaly was first discovered, the depleted uranium-235 was puzzling and required explanation. The natural reactor hypothesis was proposed and confirmed by detailed isotope analysis. But had the reactor operated on a smaller scale, or had the evidence been more fragmentary, the anomaly might have been attributed to some other natural process: metamorphic redistribution of uranium, unusual ore formation chemistry, or measurement artifact. The lesson of Oklo for the Silurian hypothesis is double-edged. On one hand, it shows that anomalous nuclear isotope signatures are preserved in the geological record and can be detected 2 billion years after the fact. On the other hand, it shows that nature itself can produce nuclear reactions, that not all nuclear isotope anomalies require artificial origin. A prior civilization's nuclear waste would need to be distinguished from natural nuclear reactors like Oklo, and that distinction would require careful, quantitative isotope analysis of the specific ratios of fission products. The Oklo reactor, in other words, is both an existence proof that ancient nuclear isotope anomalies survive in the rock record, and a reminder that interpreting those anomalies correctly requires the same kind of careful, hypothesis testing work that is required to interpret any other geochemical signal. There is a further lesson from Oklo that is rarely discussed in this context. The Oklo reactor was found by accident. It was not identified by a systematic search for ancient nuclear anomalies. It was found because a routine quality control measurement at a French uranium processing plant turned up ore with the wrong isotope ratio, which led to a targeted investigation. The anomaly was large enough, and the modern analytical techniques sensitive enough, to flag it even without anyone specifically looking. How many smaller, more subtle nuclear isotope anomalies exist in the geological record and have not been identified because no one was specifically looking? The honest answer is, we do not know. systematic searches for anomalous nuclear isotope ratios in ancient rocks have not been conducted with the explicit aim of detecting artificial enrichment. The existing literature on uranium and lead isotope geochemistry is vast, but it is primarily oriented toward understanding natural, radioactive decay systems, dating rocks, and tracing geological processes. The question, does this anomaly require artificial enrichment to explain, is not routinely asked. This is actually one of the concrete, actionable recommendations that emerges from Schmidt and Frank's paper. They suggest that one productive response to the Silurian hypothesis, regardless of whether you find it plausible, is to conduct systematic searches of the geological record for the specific chemical signatures that would indicate industrial activity. Not because there is positive evidence of a prior civilization, but because the searches themselves would be scientifically valuable. Finding and characterizing all anomalous carbon isotope excursions, all anomalous trace metal concentrations, all unusual nuclear isotope ratios in ancient rocks has scientific value independent of the Silurian hypothesis. And if any of those anomalies turned out to be inconsistent with any known natural explanation, that would be significant, regardless of what ultimately caused them. Chapter 7. The Fermi Question. What kind of life could build a civilization? Before assessing the probability of a prior civilization, there is a biological question that must be addressed. And it is one that the Silurian hypothesis discussion often glosses over. What kind of organism could have built one? The naive version of the Silurian hypothesis imagines a species roughly like us. Bipedal, large-brained, tool-using, language-equipped, existing somewhere in the deep geological past. But the biology of intelligence and technology is far more constrained than this implies. We do not have abundant examples of independently evolved high intelligence to draw on. On Earth, the highest levels of abstract problem-solving, language use, and tool manipulation are concentrated in a small number of lineages: primates, particularly hominins, cetaceans, dolphins and some whales, corvids, crows and ravens, and octopuses. And only one of these has produced a civilization. The constraints on civilization building are not just cognitive. They are physical and ecological. A civilization requires energy extraction, material, manipulation, and information storage and transmission. On Earth, these capabilities emerged from a combination of bipedalism, freeing the hands for manipulation, with precision grip, binocular vision for fine motor coordination, and the specific cognitive architecture of the hominin lineage. This combination is not common in the animal kingdom. It emerged from a specific evolutionary trajectory in a specific ecological setting over a specific timescale. But that is our example. Evolution is opportunistic and path-dependent, and there is no fundamental reason why civilizational intelligence could not emerge in a very different morphological package, in a marine species, in a social insect lineage that evolved sufficient neural complexity, in a lineage of large-bodied theropod, dinosaurs, had the KPG extinction not occurred, or in some other direction entirely. The specific form of an ancient civilization is unconstrained by anything we know. What is constrained is the timeline of complex life. The Cambrian explosion, the geologically rapid diversification of complex multicellular animal life, occurred approximately 538 million years ago. Before the Cambrian, the animal lineages that eventually gave rise to vertebrates, to arthropods, to mollusks did not exist. A prior civilization before the Cambrian would have had to be built by organisms fundamentally unlike any animal that has ever existed, possibly by microbial consortia, by early eukaryotes, by something without precedent in any biological framework we currently understand. This is not impossible in principle, but it requires a level of cognitive and technological sophistication in life, forms that lack nervous systems, and which have no modern analog on which to base the speculation. Between the Cambrian and the present, the options are richer. From approximately 500 million years ago onward, there have been animals. First marine, then increasingly terrestrial, from around 375 million. Years ago, when the first tetrapods began colonizing the land, the fossil record of this period contains the ancestors of every vertebrate lineage alive today, plus many more that went extinct. Among these, there are occasional glimpses of what might have been. The theropod dinosaurs of the late Cretaceous, particularly the troodontids, show brain-to-body ratios approaching those of birds and some mammals, and some researchers have speculated, mostly informally, about what might have evolved had the dinosaurs not been eliminated. The corvid and parrot level of intelligence was clearly achievable in a theropod body plan. Whether hominin-level intelligence was achievable in a non-primate lineage, and on what timescale, is genuinely unknown. The most concrete version of this speculation was developed not by a conspiracy theorist, but by Dale Russell, a paleontologist at the National Museum of Natural Sciences in Canada, in a 1982 paper published in the journal Silurian. Russell was working with a colleague, Ron Seguin, on a thought experiment. What would a large-brained theropod dinosaur have looked like if it had continued evolving along the trajectory suggested by the troodontid lineage? The troodontids were small, agile, feathered theropods with brain-to-body ratios at the high end of the non-avian dinosaur range, comparable to living ostriches and approaching the lower range of some parrots. They had binocular vision, stereoscopic depth perception, and grasping forelimbs. Russell and Seguin constructed a speculative model of what a troodontid might have evolved into over the 64 million years between the late Cretaceous and the present, had the KPU extinction not intervened. The result, which they called a dinosauroid, was bipedal, with a large, rounded cranium, forward-facing eyes, and 3 fingered hands. It looked somewhat disconcertingly, vaguely humanoid. Russell himself was careful to note that this was a thought experiment, not a prediction. The evolutionary path from a late Cretaceous troodontid to anything with civilizational capability would require not just increased brain size, but a specific cognitive architecture, the capacity for symbolic language, for cumulative cultural transmission, for planning and abstraction beyond what any living non-human animal demonstrably possesses. Whether those capacities were evolutionarily achievable in a theropod lineage, on what timescale, and whether the ecological conditions of the Cretaceous would have selected for them, is entirely speculative. But the thought experiment serves a purpose. It concretizes the question. It forces you to ask not just, could a prior civilization have existed? But in what body plan, from what lineage, under what ecological conditions, over what timescale? And when you ask those questions, the answer is not impossible. It is we don't know, and we have very few analogues to reason from. The most frequently discussed candidate for a plausible prior civilization, at least in popular treatments of the Silurian hypothesis, is the late Cretaceous period, roughly 100 to 66 million years ago. The reasons are complex vertebrate life was abundant, terrestrial ecosystems were well developed, neural complexity in some dinosaur lineages was approaching the lower range of what is seen in living birds and mammals, and the Cretaceous lasted long enough for a technological lineage to emerge if the evolutionary conditions were right. Here is the sobering fact about the Cretaceous in this context. The KPG extinction 66 million years ago destroyed approximately 75% of all species on Earth, including all non-avian dinosaurs. If a technologically advanced dinosaurian lineage existed and was eliminated by the extinction, the geological evidence of its civilization would be, at most, 66 million years old. We showed in the previous chapter that a civilization 66 million years old would be at the very edge of detectability. The KPG boundary is intensively studied, and no chemical or physical signatures of industrial activity have been found in it. But the KPG boundary layer itself, the iridium-rich clay deposited globally by the asteroid impact, would overprint and possibly mask subtler industrial signatures immediately below it. The biology does not rule out a prior civilization in the Cretaceous or earlier Mesozoic. It does not rule one out in the Paleozoic either, though the cognitive prerequisites become harder to meet as you go further back. What the biology does is sharpen the question from could there have been any prior civilization to what specific lineages, in what specific periods, had any realistic chance of producing one. And the honest answer is that the number of plausible candidates is small, the required evolutionary trajectory is specific, and the evidence we would expect to find, if any of those candidates actually made it, is close to the edge of what the geological record can preserve. Chapter 8: The specific geological anomalies that need explaining. Part 1 established the theoretical framework. The geological record has specific limitations, industrial civilization leaves specific signatures, and the detection horizon means that a prior civilization more than 50 to 100 million years old would be largely invisible to current methods. Now it is time to ask the sharper question. Are there anomalies in the geological record that fit the expected signature of prior industrial activity and that lack a fully satisfying natural explanation? The answer is yes, there are several. None of them constitutes evidence for a prior civilization. Each of them has proposed natural explanations. But the existence of unresolved anomalies in the categories most relevant to the Silurian hypothesis is worth examining carefully, because it is the kind of question that gets asked differently once you know what you are looking for. The PETM was discussed in Part 1 as the most prominent example, a carbon isotope excursion of the right type, at the right rate, associated with global warming and ocean acidification of the right magnitude, whose cause remains genuinely uncertain despite decades of intensive study. But the PETM is not the only carbon isotope excursion in the geological record whose origin is debated. The Cambrian itself contains a series of large, rapid carbon isotope oscillations in its early stages, around 538 to 520 million years ago, collectively referred to as the Spice, Arois, and several other named excursions. These oscillations are among the most dramatic in the Phanerozoic carbon isotope record, some exceeding 4 to 5 per mil in delta, C13, which is large by any standard. Their causes are actively debated. Proposed explanations include changes in the burial rate of organic carbon driven by the evolution of biomineralizing animals, creating new ecological niches, shifts in ocean circulation patterns, large-scale volcanism, and feedback cycles in the early Cambrian carbon cycle that are not fully understood. The early Cambrian is approximately at the outer edge of the detection horizon for industrial civilization. The anomalies in its carbon isotope record are large enough that an industrial signal would be competing with substantial natural noise in any case. But the point is that the carbon cycle of the early Cambrian was genuinely disturbed in ways that are not fully explained, and that the disturbance had the right character, rapid, isotopically light carbon injection, to potentially include an industrial component without being easily distinguishable from the natural background. A second category of unexplained anomaly is the suite of geochemical perturbations associated with several of the so-called Big Five mass extinctions. Mass extinction events are, by definition, periods of geologically rapid biotic crisis, exactly what the Silurian hypothesis would predict as a consequence of civilizational collapse. The end Ordovician extinction, 443 million years ago, the late Devonian extinction, 375 to 360 million years ago, the end Permian extinction, 252 million years ago, the end Triassic extinction, 201 million years ago, and the Capege extinction, 66 million years ago, all have associated geochemical anomalies, carbon isotope excursions, trace metal enrichments, organic biomarker anomalies, some of which are well explained by known natural causes, and some of which retain aspects that are not fully understood. The end Permian extinction is the most severe, the Great Dying, which eliminated approximately 96% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species. Its primary cause is attributed to the Siberian Trap's large igneous province, a period of massive flood basalt volcanism that released enormous quantities of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide over tens of thousands of years. But the end Permian also shows a sharp, anomalously large negative carbon isotope excursion, larger than can be explained by volcanic carbon alone, that has led to proposals for additional carbon sources including methane hydrate destabilization, burning of Siberian coal deposits, and other mechanisms. The anomaly is large, rapid, and not fully accounted for by the primary volcanic explanation. Is any of this evidence for industrial activity? No. The volcanic hypothesis for the end Permian is well supported, and the consensus explanation among paleontologists and geochemists. The residual uncertainties are genuinely residual, details to be refined, not fundamental gaps in the causal story. But it illustrates that the categories of anomaly most relevant to the Silurian hypothesis, unexplained carbon isotope excursions, mass extinctions without fully satisfying causal explanations, do exist in the ancient record, and they exist in the periods that are at or near the detection horizon. There is one more category of anomaly that deserves mention, and it is more specific and more unusual than the others. In the 1990s and 2000s, a series of analyses of impact proximate sediments from several geological boundaries found anomalous concentrations of iridium and platinum group elements at levels inconsistent with background cosmic flux and inconsistent with the specific signature of the known bolide impacts at those boundaries. Some of these anomalies were proposed as evidence for multiple impactors, for comet showers, or for unusual mantle plume activity, explanations that have been variably accepted. None was proposed as evidence for industrial activity, but the existence of unexplained trace metal enrichments at geological boundaries is again the kind of anomaly that would fall into the deserves more systematic examination category under the Silurian framework. The point is not that any of these anomalies is evidence for a prior civilization. The point is that the geological record contains unresolved puzzles in exactly the categories that industrial activity would perturb: carbon cycle, trace metals, mass extinction rates, and that the resolution of those puzzles, whatever it turns out to be, requires the same systematic geochemical investigation that a targeted Silurian search would employ. The scientific work is valuable either way. Chapter 9: What a Collapse Looks Like. The Archaeological Invisibility Problem. Even setting aside the chemical signals, there is a separate problem with detecting a prior civilization that is rarely given adequate attention: the problem of physical artifacts. When people imagine detecting an ancient civilization, they tend to think about physical objects: ruins, tools, buried cities, the kind of thing archaeologists find when they excavate ancient human settlements. This intuition is reasonable for civilizations of the historical period, the last 10,000 years, roughly. Bronze Age cities, Roman roads, medieval cathedrals, Aztec pyramids, all of these survive in recognizable form after a few thousand years, because a few thousand years is not very long in geological time, and because stone and fired clay are relatively resistant to surface weathering. But the intuition breaks down completely at geological timescales. At 1 million years, almost nothing built by a technological civilization would remain. At 10 million years, nothing. The processes that destroy surface structures on geological timescales are comprehensive. Chemical weathering degrades stone, oxidation destroys metals, tectonic activity buries and crushes structures under kilometers of rock. Erosion strips away surface layers, and sea level changes repeatedly inundate and expose continental shelf environments. The entire visible surface of the Earth is, in the geological sense, extremely young. Most of it has been recycled within the last few tens of millions of years. Consider what survives of human civilization from just 1 million years ago. There was no human civilization 1 million years ago, but there were hominins. Homo erectus, the most widely distributed hominin of the early Pleistocene, used stone tools, controlled fire, and may have had some form of social structure. The evidence for all of this is fragmentary. A few hundred stone tool sites, some burned earth, a small number of fossilized bones. The material culture of Homo erectus, despite being produced by a species that was abundant and widely distributed for over 1 million years, is represented in the geological record by a handful of rock chips and charred deposits. Now imagine a technological civilization with complex infrastructure, using metals, ceramics, plastics, and processed stone that existed and collapsed 10 million years ago. What would survive? Not buildings, the most durable building material. Reinforced concrete has a structural lifetime of perhaps a few hundred years before it begins to crack and crumble, and a few thousand years before it is unrecognizable as a manufactured object. Not metal artifacts. Iron corrodes completely within thousands of years in most environments. Even the most corrosion-resistant metals, like platinum and gold, would be physically dispersed and geochemically diluted within millions of years. Not plastics. As discussed earlier, the specific polymer structures would be broken down and converted to hydrocarbons chemically similar to natural organic material. What might survive is the chemically anomalous signature of processed materials in trace concentrations in sediment. The specific isotope ratios of refined metals dispersed into the environment. The molecular remnants of synthetic compounds not produced by any biological process. The isotopic record of altered carbon and nitrogen cycles. To make this concrete, consider the survivability timeline for specific categories of material. Glass, which requires high temperature, furnaces, and is therefore a marker of industrial heat processing, begins to devitrify and crystallize over geological timescales. In most geological environments, glass older than a few million years has been converted to secondary minerals unrecognizable as glass. Occasionally, obsidian natural glass survives for millions of years, but manufactured glass of different chemical composition would likely not be identifiable as manufactured at geological timescales. Fired ceramic, pottery, brick, tile is more durable. Some ancient ceramics survive for hundreds of thousands of years in favorable conditions, and the firing process changes the magnetic orientation of iron minerals in ways that can be detected in archaeological contexts. But fired ceramic is chemically similar to natural volcanic rock and metamorphic material. Distinguishing manufactured ceramic from natural silicate rock at millions of years distance without contextual information would be extremely difficult. The magnetic signature might persist longer than the visual one, but magnetic signatures in rocks are extensively modified by diagenetic processes and metamorphism over geological time. Worked stone, the most durable physical artifact of human culture, would be destroyed not by chemical degradation, but by physical dispersal. A carved stone monument, buried under sediment and subjected to geological timescales of compaction, fluid flow, and chemical exchange, would lose its surface details within millions of years and would eventually be reduced to individual mineral grains, indistinguishable from naturally weathered rock. There is no chemical difference between a granite block carved by human hands and a granite block produced by natural processes. Only the shape distinguishes them, and a shape does not survive. The exception is synthetic materials with no natural analog. Certain industrial alloys, steel, aluminium, titanium, alloys, rare earth element compounds have compositions that do not occur naturally, and their chemical signature in sediment would be anomalous. But these anomalies would be at the trace level, parts per billion or parts per trillion in the bulk sediment, and would require targeted analytical search to find. They would not announce themselves. In other words, exactly the geochemical signatures that were the focus of Chapter 5. The physical archaeology of a civilization millions of years old is zero. The geochemical archaeology is marginal, but potentially non-zero. This creates a deeply counterintuitive implication. The most sophisticated and durable structures built by a civilization, its greatest engineering achievements, its largest cities, its most permanent monuments, would be the first things erased by geological time. The most ephemeral and seemingly insignificant outputs, the carbon dioxide released by its power plants, the heavy metals scattered by its industrial processes, the synthetic nitrogen dispersed by its agriculture, are the outputs most likely to leave a detectable trace millions of years later. A prior civilization would be geologically invisible in everything we associate with civilization, and potentially detectable only in its pollution. There is something philosophically striking about this. If a future geologist in 100 million years wanted to determine whether a technological species had existed on Earth, the most useful evidence would not be any of the things we consider our achievements. It would be our damage. The carbon we burned, the metals we dispersed, the species we drove extinct, the nitrogen we fixed and spread into waterways. These are the outputs most likely to survive in the geological record. Our cathedrals and our computers, our literature and our art, our scientific achievements, all of it will be gone without a trace. The waste products of industrial capitalism will outlast everything else we have made. This is the archaeological invisibility problem, and it applies with equal force to any prior civilization. Whatever achievements a prior industrial species had, whatever equivalent of art, science, culture, and technology it possessed, none of that would survive. The only survival channel is the environmental disruption. The prior civilization would be visible, if at all, only through what it destroyed. Chapter 10: The Anthropocene as a Test Case. What future geologists will actually find. The Anthropocene provides a live test of the Silurian Hypothesis framework. We are currently in the process of writing our entry into the geological record, and we can ask, with some precision, what that entry will look like to a geologist 50 million years from now. This exercise is not hypothetical. It is a question geologists have actually worked through, and the results are illuminating. The geologist of the deep future, 50 million years from now, let us say, would examine the rock record of the current epoch and find a specific set of anomalies compressed into a layer of altered sediment. Here is what that layer would contain and how long each signature would survive. The radionuclide layer, the CS-137 and Pu-239/240 deposited globally by nuclear weapons testing, would persist for roughly 300,000 years before decaying to undetectable levels. At 50 million years, it would be completely gone. Our most distinctive artificial isotope signature, the one most unambiguously non-natural, would vanish well before the detection window begins to fail. The synthetic organic compounds, the PCBs, the flame retardants, the specific industrial PAH ratios, would persist in chemically recognizable form for perhaps tens of thousands to a few 100,000 years in favorable conditions. In most rock environments, diagenetic alteration would have converted them to simpler hydrocarbons within a few million years. At 50 million years, the specific molecular structures would likely be unrecognizable. Some would leave anomalous concentrations of certain hydrocarbons in sediment, but the specific compound identities would be lost. The carbon isotope excursion, the Suez effect of isotopically depleted fossil fuel carbon in the atmosphere and ocean would persist in marine carbonates and organic matter for tens of millions of years. The magnitude of the current excursion is comparable to the PETM excursion, and the PETM excursion is clearly visible and well characterized in 56 million-year-old sediments. The current carbon isotope anomaly would likely be visible in 50 million-year-old rocks. It would be ambiguous, naturally explainable by volcanism or methane release without additional context. But it would be there. The nitrogen isotope anomaly, the Haber-Bosch signature in lake and coastal sediments, would persist in sediment for millions to tens of millions of years in favorable depositional environments. Whether it would be clearly distinguishable from natural nitrogen, isotope variations in 50 million-year-old rock is uncertain. The nitrogen isotope record of the geological past is not as well studied as the carbon record, and natural variations are not fully characterized. The trace metal pollution signature, the elevated concentrations of lead, copper, zinc, and mercury in sediments worldwide, would persist in chemically mobilized form for millions of years, potentially tens of millions, though the specific spatial distribution and isotope ratios would be progressively homogenized by diagenetic processes. At 50 million years, anomalous trace metal concentrations might still be detectable in deep-sea sediment cores from the current epoch. Though the signal would be degraded, the mass extinction signal, the rapid loss of a significant fraction of Earth's species coinciding with the other chemical anomalies, would be visible in the fossil record for hundreds of millions of years, or as long as the Atoye fossil record preserved any biological information at all. Mass extinctions are the most durable signal in the rock record. The KPG extinction is unambiguously visible in 66 million-year-old rocks. The Permian extinction is unambiguously visible in 252 million-year-old rocks. The current extinction event, if it reaches the magnitude that current trajectories project, would be visible as a geologically abrupt species loss event in the fossil record for as long as the fossil record exists. Now, the question the future geologist must answer: given all of these signals in the rock record, would they conclude that an industrial civilization had been present? The carbon isotope excursion, in isolation, could be attributed to volcanism or methane release. Natural processes produce similar signatures. The trace metal anomalies, in isolation, could be attributed to unusual volcanic or hydrothermal activity. The nitrogen anomaly, if preserved, might be ambiguous. The mass extinction is a significant red flag, but mass extinctions have natural causes. The KPG impact, the Siberian traps. Any one of these signals has a natural explanation, but here is the key point: all of them occurring simultaneously. At exactly the same geological moment, the same centimeter in the rock column, is not easily explained by any single natural process. A volcanic event would produce a carbon isotope excursion, but not a global mass extinction synchronized with trace metal pollution in specific non-volcanic ratios, and a nitrogen isotope anomaly in lacustrine sediments, and a synthetic hydrocarbon anomaly in organic-rich layers. The co-occurrence of multiple independent chemical anomalies at a single horizon, each consistent with industrial activity and none fully explained by any single natural process, would be, to a rigorous future geologist, a very unusual record. Would it be conclusive? Probably not. The future geologist, lacking our perspective, would face the same interpretive challenge that we face when examining the PETM, multiple partially consistent hypotheses, no single definitive test, and the pragmatic scientific tendency to favor the simplest natural explanation over an extraordinary one. But it would be anomalous. It would be a record worth investigating carefully. And if the future geologist had the framework of the Silurian Hypothesis, if they were specifically looking for signatures of prior industrial civilization, the Anthropocene layer would pass the initial screening test. This is precisely the kind of record that Schmidt and Frank are arguing we should look for in the ancient geological record. Not a smoking gun, a constellation of co-occurring anomalies, each explicable but none fully convincing in isolation, appearing simultaneously at a single geological horizon. That is what industrial civilization looks like from 50 million years of distance. There is an important methodological point buried here that deserves explicit attention. The standard practice in geology when confronted with a puzzling event is to identify the simplest natural explanation consistent with all the available evidence. This is good scientific practice. Occam's razor applied to the rock record. If a carbon isotope excursion can be explained by a large igneous province, geologists attribute it to a large igneous province. If a mass extinction coincides with an iridium anomaly, they attribute it to a bolide impact. The presumption of natural causation is not merely a bias. It is epistemically justified by the fact that natural geological events are vastly more common than industrial civilizations, of which we know exactly one example. But this presumption creates a specific blind spot for the Silurian hypothesis. If the working assumption is always natural cause, then no pattern of evidence, however consistent with industrial activity, would ever be interpreted as industrial activity, because the industrial interpretation would always be outcompeted by some natural hypothesis on Occam's razor grounds, as long as the natural hypothesis is not ruled out. The remedy is not to abandon the presumption of natural causation. It is to establish what a specifically industrial fingerprint would look like. What constellation of co-occurring anomalies, at what spatial and temporal scales, would be inconsistent with any natural process and require an industrial explanation. Schmidt and Frank's paper was a first attempt at specifying this. The specific pattern they argued would be most diagnostic: a carbon isotope excursion coinciding with a nitrogen isotope excursion, coinciding with elevated trace metal concentrations, coinciding with anomalous organic biomarkers, coinciding with a mass extinction signal, all at the same stratigraphic horizon, with the temporal coincidence tighter than any known natural process can produce. No such precise co-occurrence has been identified in the geological record, but the search for it, a targeted, hypothesis-driven search using the diagnostic criteria Schmidt and Frank specified, has not been conducted systematically. Most geological investigations examine one or two of these proxies in a given record. Few have examined all of them simultaneously at the same stratigraphic resolution with the explicit question of industrial origin in mind. Chapter 11. SETI and the Silurian Hypothesis. What it means for the search for life. The Silurian hypothesis sits at an intersection of questions that do not usually appear in the same discussion: astrobiology, paleontology, and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. But Schmidt and Frank argued, persuasively, we think, that the hypothesis has significant implications for how we think about the prevalence of technological life in the universe, and therefore for SETI. The standard framework for thinking about the prevalence of technological civilizations in the galaxy is the Drake equation, proposed by Frank Drake in 1961. The equation multiplies together a series of factors: the rate of star formation in the galaxy, the fraction of stars with planets, the fraction of those planets that develop life, the fraction where life develops intelligence, the fraction where intelligence develops communicating technology, and the average lifespan of a technological civilization. The product of these factors gives the number of technologically communicating civilizations currently active in the galaxy. The Drake equation has famously wide uncertainties. The first few factors, star formation rates, planetary occurrence, are now reasonably well constrained by astronomical observations. The biological and sociological factors, the fraction of planets developing life, of life developing intelligence, of intelligence developing technology, and the average civilizational lifespan remain almost entirely unconstrained. We have one data point, Earth, and that data point contains an awkward circularity because we are the observers. The Silurian hypothesis adds a complication to this framework that is rarely discussed. If technological civilizations can arise, peak, and collapse without leaving a detectable record, if the geological archive of a planet's history is blind to prior civilizations beyond a certain temporal horizon, then our assessment of Earth's history as containing exactly one technological civilization, AS, is not a confirmed fact. It is a statement about what we can detect, which covers only a fraction of the available window. This matters for the Drake equation in a specific way. One of the key terms is the average lifespan of a technological civilization, often written as L. If L is very short, if civilizations typically collapse within thousands of years, then at any given moment, the galaxy would contain very few active civilizations, even if intelligence is common. If L is very long, if civilizations persist for millions or billions of years, then the galaxy might be full of them, and our failure to detect them requires other explanations. The Silurian hypothesis raises a different question. What if L is not just about lifespan, but about iteration? What if technological civilizations arise, collapse, and arise again, repeatedly on geological timescales, on individual planets? If a civilization collapses catastrophically through climate change, nuclear war, resource exhaustion, pandemic, or some combination, and the planet then recovers biologically, there is no fundamental reason why a second technological species could not eventually evolve. The recovery of complex ecosystems after mass extinctions is a geological fact. The biosphere has recovered, in terms of diversity and complexity, after every mass extinction in Earth's history, typically within a few million to tens of millions of years. If the recovery produces the ecological conditions for a new lineage to develop intelligence, the process could repeat. This reframes the question of technological civilizations from a single event question. does intelligence evolve? To a rate question. How often does it evolve per billion years per planet, integrated over the planet's entire habitability window? And if Earth's history contains multiple iterations below the detection horizon, the per-planet rate of civilization emergence might be significantly higher than the 1 in 4.5 billion years rate suggested by our single visible data point. Frank and Schmidt extended this argument in a 2019 paper titled The Anthropocene Generalization, where they argued that the question of whether Earth has hosted prior civilizations is directly connected to the question of whether civilizations are common or rare in the universe. If civilizations are common, if the emergence of technology is a likely outcome of complex biospheres given enough time, then the expected number of prior civilizations on Earth over its 4.5 billion year history is not negligible. If civilizations are rare, if Earth's emergence of technology was an extraordinarily improbable event, then prior civilizations are unlikely but not impossible. Either way, the Silurian hypothesis highlights a limitation in our use of Earth as the sole data point for the Drake equation. We assume Earth's technological civilization count is 1 because we see one, but we cannot see below the detection horizon. Our use of Earth's record as evidence for the rarity of technological intelligence is undermined if that record is systematically incomplete in precisely the way the Silurian hypothesis suggests. The connection to the Fermi paradox is worth developing further because it reveals something about the structure of the problem that is not immediately obvious. The Fermi paradox in its classic form asks, if intelligent life is common in the galaxy, why don't we see evidence of it? The standard answers include, maybe intelligence is rare, the rare Earth hypothesis. Maybe civilizations destroy themselves, the great filter. Maybe interstellar travel and communication are harder than assumed. Or maybe we are simply not looking in the right way. Each of these answers has been extensively analyzed, and none is definitively confirmed. The Silurian hypothesis adds a Fermi paradox adjacent question that applies to our own planet. If intelligent life has arisen on Earth once in 4.5 billion years, should we be surprised by that rate? And the answer, if prior civilizations are possible below the detection horizon, is that we don't actually know the rate. The emergence of intelligence on Earth might have happened once, or it might have happened multiple times, with all previous occurrences invisible to us. The rate, the fundamental parameter in any assessment of the prevalence of intelligence in the galaxy, is not known. This connects to what some astrobiologists have called galactic archaeology, the idea that the history of intelligent life in the galaxy might be readable not just from current signals, radio transmissions, industrial biosignatures, but from the cumulative record left by past civilizations on the surfaces and in the atmospheres of planets. A planet that has hosted successive technological civilizations, each collapsing and being replaced over geological time, would have a complex geochemical history that might be partly readable from its current atmospheric composition. If the civilizations were recent enough to have left surviving atmospheric signatures. For Earth, this is mainly a theoretical exercise because our own recent civilization dominates the current atmospheric signal. But for exoplanets, worlds that might be hosting their 3rd or 4th or 10th technological civilization, the cumulative geochemical record might be more complex and harder to interpret than we currently assume. The simple model of detectable biosignature equals current technological activity might be systematically misleading for planets with long histories of successive civilizations, each leaving stratified chemical layers in the sediment and trace residues in the atmosphere. There is a further implication for astrobiology that is more immediately practical. One of the proposed methods for detecting technological civilizations on exoplanets is the detection of atmospheric biosignatures, specific gases in a planet's atmosphere that are not in chemical equilibrium and therefore require a biological or industrial source. Oxygen, methane, nitrous oxide, and various industrial pollutants have all been proposed as potential biosignatures detectable by future space telescopes. The James Webb Space Telescope has already begun characterizing the atmospheres of some exoplanets, though current sensitivity is insufficient for Earth-like worlds around Sun-like stars. The Silurian Hypothesis adds a dimension to this search. Even if a planet currently shows no biosignatures of technological activity, it might have hosted a technological civilization in its past. A planet examined and found clean, no industrial pollutants, no anomalous atmospheric chemistry, might have hosted 10 successive civilizations, all of them extinct, their atmospheric signatures long since dispersed. The absence of a currently detectable technological signature on an exoplanet is not evidence that technological life never arose there. It is evidence that no technological life is currently active there. This is the exoplanetary version of the Silurian problem. The observational window is even narrower for exoplanets than for Earth's geological record. For exoplanets, the window is not the last 50 to 100 million years, but the current moment. A planet with a rich history of successive civilizations, all now extinct, would look to an external observer exactly like a planet that had never hosted a civilization at all. Chapter 12. The Honest Assessment, Probability, Evidence, and What We Can Say. At this point in the video, it is important to be precise about what the Silurian Hypothesis claims, what the evidence says, and what conclusions are and are not justified. The Silurian Hypothesis does not claim that a prior civilization existed on Earth. It does not assert anomalies that lack natural explanations. It does not argue that any specific geological event was caused by industrial activity. It is a formally posed question about detectability. Given the limitations of the geological record, what would we expect to find if a prior industrial civilization had existed? And would we recognize it? That framing is important because the hypothesis is frequently mischaracterized in popular media as either a fringe claim that a dinosaur civilization existed or as a debunked idea because no evidence has been found. Both mischaracterizations miss the point. The hypothesis is not a claim about what happened. It is a claim about the limits of what we can know. So what can we actually say with confidence? We can say, with confidence, that the geological record cannot exclude a prior civilization that existed more than 50 to 100 million years ago. This is not a weak statement. It is a strong one. The record is not merely incomplete in a random way. It is systematically blind to exactly the kinds of signals industrial activity produces at those timescales. The absence of detected evidence is not evidence of absence, because the detection capability is insufficient. We can say, with moderate confidence, that the geological record of the last 66 million years, the Cenozoic, has been fairly thoroughly examined for major geochemical anomalies, and no anomalies have been identified that require industrial activity to explain. The PETM is anomalous but has natural hypotheses. The various Eocene, Oligocene, and Miocene carbon isotope events are understood within the framework of natural carbon cycle variation. No human geologist has yet published a paper arguing that a specific geological event in the Cenozoic requires a non-natural industrial explanation. The record is clean in the sense that nothing has been found that demands the Silurian hypothesis to explain it. We can say, with somewhat less confidence, that the record of the Mesozoic and Paleozoic, older than 66 million years and extending to the beginning of the Cambrian, is less thoroughly examined and less well understood. The carbon isotope record of the Cambrian, the geochemistry of some Paleozoic boundaries, and the detailed trace metal records of pre-Cenozoic sediments are less well characterized than the Cenozoic record. The absence of identified anomalies in these older periods is less informative because the tools to identify such anomalies have not been as rigorously applied. What we cannot say is that the Silurian hypothesis is ruled out. It is not. The framework Schmidt and Frank established, the detection horizon, the specific chemical signatures to look for, the understanding of which signals would survive and which would not, does not have a falsifiable prediction that has been tested and failed. A confirmed absence of anomalies across the full relevant geological record after systematic targeted searches using the diagnostic criteria Schmidt and Frank specified would provide the strongest possible evidence against a prior civilization in the detectable window. That systematic search has not been done. There is a probability question that is harder to answer honestly. What is the prior probability, before examining any evidence, that a technological civilization arose on Earth in the geological past? The answer depends on several unresolved questions. How common is the emergence of high intelligence in complex biospheres? How often does technological capability develop from high intelligence? What fraction of technological civilizations survive long enough to leave detectable geological signatures? None of these questions has a quantitative answer based on anything other than our single data point. The prior probability estimate is essentially unconstrained. It could be anywhere from negligibly small to surprisingly substantial. What Schmidt and Frank's analysis shows is that the prior probability is not zero, and that the evidence available to update that prior is less informative than most people assume. The geological record of the last 50 to 100 million years is reasonably informative. A prior civilization in that window that was comparable in industrial intensity to our own would likely have left some detectable traces, and the absence of such traces is weakly informative. The geological record older than 100 million years is largely uninformative. It cannot distinguish between no prior civilization and prior civilization existed but left no surviving detectable trace. The prior probability, updated by the available evidence, produces a posterior probability that is genuinely uncertain but not negligible. This is the honest answer. What would actually change that posterior probability? what evidence would meaningfully update it in either direction? This is the most practically important question the Silurian hypothesis raises, and it has a concrete answer. On the evidence against side, a systematic, targeted geochemical survey of the most critical geological intervals, the Cenozoic boundaries, the Mesozoic-Cenozoic boundary, the major Mesozoic carbon isotope events, using the full suite of diagnostic proxies Schmidt and Frank specified, conducted at high stratigraphic resolution, and finding no anomalies inconsistent with natural processes, would substantially lower the posterior probability that a prior civilization existed in the last 100 million years. This would not rule out prior civilizations beyond the detection horizon, but it would tighten the constraints on the detectable window. On the evidence for side, discovery of a stratigraphic horizon showing simultaneous, precisely co-occurring anomalies in carbon isotopes, nitrogen isotopes, trace metals, organic biomarkers, and a biological extinction event, with the temporal coincidence tighter than any known natural forcing can produce, and the specific combination inconsistent with any single natural process, would constitute the first positive evidence requiring serious consideration of the industrial hypothesis. Not proof, but evidence that demands explanation. Additionally, a targeted search for anomalous nuclear isotope ratios, specifically the lead isotope signatures of uranium enrichment and the specific fission product ratios inconsistent with natural nuclear reactions. In ancient sedimentary rocks from multiple geological periods would be scientifically valuable. If such signatures were found, they would be the most unambiguous possible evidence for artificial nuclear processing. If they were not found across a comprehensive sample, that negative result would be the strongest evidence available against a prior nuclear-capable civilization in the accessible geological record. None of this work has been done as a targeted program. The scientific community's attention has not been focused on these questions in this way, partly because the Silurian hypothesis has been received with the skepticism appropriate to an extraordinary claim, and partly because the hypothesis is not yet well enough known outside a relatively small community of astrobiologists and paleoclimatologists. Schmidt and Frank's paper cited its own novelty as a reason for the lack of systematic follow-up. The question had not been formally posed before, so the systematic search had not been designed. That is beginning to change. Since the 2018 paper, several research groups have begun examining specific geological intervals for the multi-proxy co-occurrence signature that the hypothesis predicts. No positive result has been published, but the search has barely started. Conclusion: why this question matters. Even if the answer is no, everything in this video has been building toward a question that is, in its most fundamental form, about the relationship between knowledge and ignorance. We live in an era of remarkable scientific achievement. We have mapped the human genome, detected gravitational waves from colliding black holes, sequenced the climatic history of the last 800,000 years from Antarctic ice cores, and characterized the atmospheres of planets orbiting distant stars. The tools of modern science are extraordinarily powerful. We are accustomed to thinking of scientific ignorance as a temporary condition, a gap that will be closed by the next instrument, the next expedition, the next experiment. the Silurian hypothesis reveals a different kind of ignorance, structural ignorance. Not ignorance from lack of effort or inadequate tools, but ignorance that arises from the fundamental architecture of the evidence available. The distinction matters. When we are ignorant because we have not yet looked hard enough, because the telescope is not powerful enough, the sequencer not sensitive enough, the survey not yet complete, the ignorance is in principle remediable. Build a bigger telescope, run a more comprehensive survey, wait for the technology to improve. The ignorance is a temporary condition bounded by practical limits, not fundamental ones. Structural ignorance is different. The geological record cannot be made more complete by any instrument we could build. The processes of diagenesis, metamorphism, tectonic subduction, and erosion are ongoing, irreversible, and have already operated on the relevant rocks for tens to hundreds of millions of years. No analytical technique, however sensitive, can recover information that was chemically destroyed millions of years ago. The detection horizon is not a technological limit. It is a physical one, written into the chemistry of how rocks form, change, and survive. This is a category of ignorance that modern science is relatively unaccustomed to acknowledging. We live in an era of expanding observational capability, where the standard trajectory is from ignorance to knowledge through improved measurement. The Silurian hypothesis points to a domain where that trajectory hits a wall, not a temporary wall, but a permanent one, set by the physics of the available evidence. The appropriate response to this kind of ignorance is neither to fill the gap with speculation, nor to pretend the gap does not exist. It is to characterize the gap as precisely as possible, to know exactly what we do not know and why, and to extract maximum information from the evidence that does exist, while being honest about what it cannot tell us. The geological record cannot tell us what happened before the detection horizon, not because we have not looked hard enough, but because the processes that preserve geological evidence operate on timescales that erase exactly the kinds of signals we would need to look for. This is a hard limit, not a soft one. And this kind of structural ignorance has a specific epistemic implication. We cannot treat the absence of evidence as evidence of absence. Not for ancient civilizations, not for prior industrial epochs, not for any events that fall below the detection horizon of the available evidence. The silence of the geological record before 50 to 100 million years ago on the question of technological intelligence is not reassuring. It is simply uninformative. There is a broader message here that extends beyond the specific question of prior civilizations. The Anthropocene is unique in human history. It is the first time a technological species has left a planet-scale geological signature. But the first time we can confirm and the first time it happened are not the same statement. The geological record is not a complete transcript of Earth's history. It is a fragmentary, biased, degraded archive with large gaps at exactly the points where the evidence would be most relevant to questions about the emergence of intelligence and technology. Schmidt and Frank were careful in their original paper to say that the probability of a prior civilization was low. This is probably correct. The emergence of technological intelligence appears to require a long and specific evolutionary trajectory. and the geological record of the Cenozoic is at least reasonably consistent with our being the first. But probably the first is not the same as certainly the first, and the difference matters. It matters for our understanding of Earth's history. If we are the first, then the emergence of technology on Earth was a singular event, and the study of how and why it happened is the study of a unique occurrence. If we are not the first, if there were predecessors, however different, however distant in time, then the emergence of technology is a repeating phenomenon, and the study of how and why it happens becomes a comparative science. It matters for our understanding of our own position. The Silurian Hypothesis, taken seriously, removes one of the implicit certainties of the human self-image, that we are categorically special because we are the first intelligence to arise on this planet. We may be the first intelligence in the detectable window. Whether we are the first in the full history of Earth is a question the geological record cannot currently answer. And it matters, perhaps most urgently, for what it tells us about ourselves right now. We are currently writing our entry into the geological record. The Anthropocene layer, compressed to a centimeter of altered sediment in 50 million years, will carry the geochemical signature of our choices. The carbon we released, the species we eliminated, the nitrogen we fixed and dispersed. These outputs, the damage, will outlast every artifact of human culture and achievement. If a prior civilization existed and collapsed, it would be visible to us only through its damage. Its achievements, whatever they were, would be gone. We would know it only by the mark it left on the carbon cycle, the trace metals it scattered into sediment, the species it drove to extinction. And if we collapse, if industrial civilization ends, by our own hand or by external catastrophe, leaving no successor, the same would be true of us. A future intelligence arising on a recovered Earth would find in the rock record not our art or our science or our philosophy or our compassion. It would find our carbon, our lead, our nitrogen, and the hollow of our extinction event. The Silurian Hypothesis is not a warning. Schmidt and Frank did not write it as one. It is a scientific question about detectability. But the question, followed carefully to its end, arrives at something that functions as a mirror. What we would find of a prior civilization is exactly what we are leaving behind. The geological signature of a species that burned through its planet's carbon reserves, disrupted its nitrogen cycle, acidified its oceans, and drove a mass extinction is not a description of a hypothetical predecessor. It is a description of us. Right now, in the process of being written. Whether that is terrifying, motivating, or simply clarifying depends on what you do with it. The question of whether we are the first civilization on Earth cannot be answered with certainty. But the question of what the next civilization will find when it examines our record, that one can be answered. And the answer depends entirely on choices being made in the present by people who will never see the geological layer they are writing. That is why the Silurian Hypothesis matters. Not because a prior civilization probably existed, but because whether it did or not, we are now the species in the geological record, the one whose choices will be compressed into a centimeter of altered sediment and read or not read by whatever comes after.